Grief is hard, but getting good grief support doesn't have to be. That's why I love text-based grief support from Grief Coach. For less than the price of an hour's therapy, Grief Coach sends you thoughtful tips and resources about life after loss all year long. Texts are curated by grief experts and authors and can be customized based on relationship, cause of death, and more. You also receive personalized texts for grief anniversaries and special days, and extra support around the holiday season. And if you have friends or family members who want to help you grieve but aren't sure how, you can add them to your subscription and Grief Coach will text them grief support tips and reminders of your important dates, because no one should ever have to grieve alone. Sign up for Grief Coach's text-based grief support today at grief.coach/ShelbyForsythia. You can find a link in the show notes. Hello and welcome to Grief Book Roundup, a podcast where I introduce you to a grief book I love in 10 minutes or less. I'm Shelby Forsythia, an intuitive grief guide and author who helps grieving people come back to life after devastating loss. My mom's death in 2013 made me a student of grief, and I'm perpetually reading books related to loss, transformation, and finding your way after everything falls apart. Here, I'll share them with you. On Grief Book Roundup, I'll introduce you to grief books new and old, highlight marginalized authors and underrepresented grief stories, and remind you in whatever loss you're facing, you are not alone. Let's get to today's book. Hi there, grief growers, and welcome to another episode of Grief Book Roundup. Thanks so much for joining me today. The book I'd like to bring to your ears and hopefully to your hands this week is a book called Dancing at the Pity Party by Tyler Feder. I came across this book in the spring of 2020, so sometime last year. I flipped through a few pages and I immediately put it back down because I knew that it was going to land severely close to home for me. As a fellow #motherless daughter and general human navigating the first few months of the COVID-19 pandemic, I thought that reading this book, this graphic memoir, would be too much for me to handle emotionally. And I found out that I was both right and wrong. When I finally sat down with Dancing at the Pity Party about a year later, what I experienced is a charmingly illustrated graphic memoir about the bigness of losing a mom at age 19 and the pervasiveness of how grief continues to show up for Tyler Feder a decade later. This book made me laugh with its humor, cry with its familiarity and resonance to my own grief story, and marvel at all of the ways that loss is both individual and universal. If you are craving a personal narrative on mother loss with a heaping side of death humor and a reflective perspective about the past and the future for dessert, Dancing at the Pity Party is for you. If I had to pick 3 words to describe this book, they would be intimate, clever, and forward-looking. I think, like any good memoir, Dancing at the Pity Party is intimate, but even more so because there are pictures. And that sounds really basic to say, but because I get to see what Tyler Feder looks like as she draws herself and her family members and the people who are supporting them and even perfect strangers that she runs into in her grief, I feel so much more immersed in her story. Graphic memoirs are almost like watching television, but in book form, and having that level of intimacy towards people's mannerisms and behaviors, I felt like I got to know her and her mom that much better. I chose the word clever for this book because the way that Tyler Feder has decided to lay out the pages of this book, the elements of her mom that she decides to show, the funny inside jokes, her little pieces of jewelry, her tricks, her mannerisms, even the things that annoyed her about her mother or the funeral service or about the fact that cancer t-shirts are everywhere and those are triggering. The ways she decided to display those visually was so smart and so clever. She kept her color palette crisp. There's not a lot of complexity in here for your eyes to navigate about, and it's very witty and cunning how it's all put together. And lastly, the third word I chose is forward-looking, because by the end of this book, you come to understand, you recognize that Feder is writing Dancing at the Pity Party 10 years out from her loss. She lost her mom in 2009, and she wrote this book in 2019. It was published in 2020. And you are recognizing that you are receiving Grief Wisdom, a memoir from someone who is a decade ahead of their loss on the road. And so, in addition to telling the story of the lead up to her mother's death, the day her mother died, the memorial services, and everything that happened after, you also get this picture of there is more beyond the acuteness of the loss. And especially if your loss is fresh, and especially if your mother loss is fresh within the first, month to 3 years, that can be really comforting that there are other people in the Motherless Daughters Club out there surviving and, even kind of thriving in the aftermath of their mother's deaths. In terms of losses included in this book, the subtitle of Dancing at the Pity Party is literally a dead mom graphic memoir. So of course the loss of her mother is the biggest loss that Feder covers in the book. She's Jewish, so expect to see a detailed look at her experience of sitting Shiva for her mom and working alongside her family and their rabbi to plan memorial arrangements. And if you're not familiar with Jewish grief, it's a little educational primer on Jewish grief in there as well, which I thought was really interesting and helpful as somebody who is not Jewish myself. Tyler Feder also highlights the grief of losing a mom in her college years, the grief of being the eldest sibling, and sometimes the irrational guilt of having more time with her mom alive than her sisters, the grief of having regrets about the past, the grief of having to live a future without her mom there, and the grief of being constantly triggered by cancer advertisements, and that one struck a particular kind of home for me. My favorite quote from the book is going to be a little bit tricky to relay over audio because, of course, you can't see the illustrations from Dancing at the Pity Party. But if you can imagine this narrative being accompanied by illustrations, by visuals of Tyler and her mom, by kind of little side comments scribbled into part of the margins or addendums onto this, you'll really get a good picture of what Dancing at the Pity Party is all about. And this starts on page 183. As the years continue to pass, I worry that I'm forgetting her. I feel like I'm on one of those moving walkways at the airport, and I can see her getting smaller and smaller as I travel slowly into the future without her. I already don't remember the sound of her voice. For a while, the outgoing message on our voicemail at home was the one that she recorded. I started hanging up after 2 rings because hearing it was too painful. Luckily, I forced myself to replay the sound of her laugh in my head so much, I'll have it always. But it's been so long since I've had her that if she mysteriously appeared on my couch, I think I'd feel shy. Since there's a strong likelihood I'll never have to worry about that, I do whatever I can to keep her alive in my life. I like to wear the perfume she wore, especially on days I know I'll need extra strength, regardless of whether the Amazon reviews call it old lady perfume. I wear some of her jewelry on special occasions. A worn photo of her keeps the expired gift cards company in my wallet, and small trinkets of her are scattered all over my apartment. My family and I quote her and talk about her all the time, no less than before she died. And sometimes we visit her grave, just for fun? I like being there when it's not a special occasion. No one's around to ask questions. I search for the nicest pebble I can find and place it carefully on her headstone. Jews use rocks instead of flowers. There are a lot of different explanations, but my favorite is that it represents a part of my soul I'm leaving with hers. The cemetery is more peaceful than sad, like a vast meadow filled with memories. When it's nice out, you can hear the birds chirping happily, unaware of how these trees they've chosen to nest in differ from the others. Sometimes I'll lie down on the soft grass of her plot, my head just below her headstone. If I close my eyes, I can picture that she's lying there, next to me. So grief growers, if you are looking for an intimate portrait on mother loss, something that really conveys the devastation and simultaneously the hilarity of being a member of the Dead Moms Club, I know that Dancing at the Pity Party would be a wonderful selection for you. Thank you so much for joining me today on Grief Book Roundup. You can find a link to buy today's book in the show notes for this episode. If you'd like to submit a grief book for the show or buy one of my books on grief, visit shelbyforsythia.com. You can follow me on social media at shelbyforsythia on Facebook and Instagram. If this podcast helped you find your next great grief read, Be sure to subscribe and leave a review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen. And if someone in your life has experienced a loss, be sure to share this show with them, especially if they love to read. I'm able to purchase grief books and keep this podcast on the air thanks to my amazing Patreon supporters. If you'd like to support Grief Book Roundup on Patreon through a yearly or monthly pledge and access live grief support calls and workshops hosted by yours truly, visit patreon.com/ShelbyForsythia. Music for Grief Book Roundup is performed by Owen Phillips. Until next time I see you, I am so proud of you and the work that you're doing in the world, and I love you. Because even through grief, we are growing.